Hey, welcome everybody to another episode of the podcast for exceptional people, where we hope to engage in conversations about education, all things past, present, and future. Joining our conversation today is Kenyon Andrews, who's going to be a speaker at a couple of different sessions at CEC Baltimore here coming up in about a week and a half. Um, One of the things that we're going to be talking about today, I hope, is one of your session, "Oh, the Stories We Could Tell: The Tales of Leadership from a Multicultural Perspective." So, Kenyon, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So let's just get right into it. What got you originally? What was your first spark to get you into examining multicultural perspectives and their influence in the classroom?
So I will say that as a Black special education teacher and navigating this field of education, it's been a journey, and it's been provided this profound affirmation, but then also this eye-opening discovery. And so one thing that I will say that has been powerfully confirmed throughout my learning journey in as a teacher is seeing the visceral importance of representation. And so seeing the faces of Black and Brown students and students from different ethnicities and cultures, it's really lit up when they see someone who looks like them leading in the classroom, and also advocating for their needs and understanding their lived experience on a deeper level. And so that is something that has been undeniable, but it also has just really reinforced what I intrinsically knew is that our presence, the presence of each and every one of us, isn't just about diversity quotas. It's about fostering a sense of belonging and validating people's identities and providing a powerful model of what they can achieve. And so there has been this disconnect. Um, I will say in education as a whole, you may have great pockets in different cities and towns and in different states, but overall in education, there is this gap that is not present.
Yeah, one thing that stood out to me there is we can all identify, and our students can identify with a role, right? The principal, the school counselor, the teacher, whoever it may be. But to identify with that person on a personal level and to know that we've shared some of the same experiences, it creates a completely different relationship. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, and so with that different relationship is I will just use death as something that is a human experience, but it affects everyone completely differently, no matter what age you are. But also, when you look at all those different layers that we come with, when you look at, um, I will say for myself, like look at how I, as a in my Black community, how we handle death. It's we don't talk about the mental health aspect of things. We don't. There aren't these four. There aren't these conversations that are being had about. Yes, we understand that this person on a spiritual aspect may have transitioned, somewhere else. However, there is the emotional aspect. There's a mental health aspect of how do you process, how do you heal emotionally and internally, even when conceptually you can understand and you can grasp, hey, this is something that happens. And so when you put it into that aspect of when you have individuals, when you have those students who are, whether they've been in foster care, whether they have encountered a death of a family member within their own household, uh, looking at all of these different things that are happening to our students, we can expect for each and every one of them to end up on the same side of how they deal with things. And so when we're talking about even disciplinary actions, hey, well, what may be causing the student to show up to school this way? What may be causing them to, want to throw a desk and chair as opposed to just sitting down and crying like another student may? Or And so those are different things that we have to take into consideration, but we also have to realize the things that our students are showing us, their actions, their conduct, it is their form of communication. Their their frontal lobes are not fully formed anywhere close to where it needs to be. And so there is this lack of grace and space that we want every student, all students to show up the same way when that cannot be the case. I will say this example, we can all go to Walmart, but we're not going to show up the same way. We're not going to dress or look the same. So why would we expect that of our students? And even more so, why would we expect that of the adults who are teaching and learning and going through this process with our students as well?
Right. So much better to just accept the folks as they show up, no matter what they're wearing when they show up, right?
Absolutely.
So you've talked about some things that have been, confirmed for you through this work and through your study here. What are a few things I wonder that you've learned new that kind of surprised you, or maybe not surprised you, but something you learned unexpectedly?
So I would say what I have learned unexpectedly is that grace is not freely given. And what I mean is when I interact with my students, when I interact with my colleagues, I don't have an expectation in the sense of this is how I want you to show up today. This is how I expect you to provide a performative role for me. I want to make sure that even if I have to teach you 20 different strategies, or even if I have to provide you with tools on how to, communicate or how to engage with others, I want to make sure that you can use those readily. And so that grace, that is something that we, within the education system, but even more so outside of education as well, there is a lack of extending each other grace of like, hey, I understand that my colleague may have had, you know, a sick child and they were up over the weekend. I can't expect them to be their usual bubbly self if they're tired, if they've been dealing with this, they've been worried about these things. But then it's also, I can expect my students who are dealing with things, as we mentioned before, to just show up and be ready to learn. We have to provide that space of grace of where we're going, hey, what's going on? Like putting that trust there, but also saying like, hey, I understand what you may be going through. I understand what you're telling me that you're dealing with, but also that grace doesn't have to look the same for every student. Hey, for one student, it may just be, let, let me give you 5 or 10 minutes to gather yourself, to really just, not have that demand put up on you. For another student, it may be, hey, you were an hour late to school and you were rushing and all of these things played a factor into it. Hey, I can provide you grace by saying, hey, let me grab you, a snack, or let me grab you something to eat. So that way they all can have the opportunity to show up as their best selves. And that is something that um, at an overwhelming rate, experiencing that lack of grace towards one another within our education system has been something that is quite surprising.
I imagine it'd be surprising and kind of difficult to see the gap of how much grace we want folks to give us or we want ourselves to have for ourselves, but we don't, right? And other people, we don't give that same grace to other people. That would be a hard gap, I think, to see in practice.
Yes, absolutely. But I also think that it's, being honest with ourselves. There is a lack of grace um, that happens even just as individuals, and that looks different. I may not have grace for myself of being like, hey, look, you know what? You lesson plan and you done all of these things. You don't need to take work home over the weekend. Like having grace even for our own selves. And that's where we also see that that lack of grace being input up on others of, hey, well, I had to do this, outside of school work or outside of, my personal life. But then it's also, then we're projecting that onto others as though they don't have responsibilities or they don't have other things that in their life matter. And so we cannot do that because it doesn't look the same. But if I know, hey, you know what? I may not be feeling my best today, and I want to just let my students know, like, hey, I'm here. I'm tired. I'm not feeling too great, but I'm here because I'm showing up for you guys. And I'm asking you guys to extend me some grace if I'm a little bit slow or if I make a mistake. All of these things of just how are we even modeling that for students? Of I can write the date, I can write 2024 down easily and go, you know what? I made a mistake. Silly me. I don't have to beat myself up over that. And so that in turn teaches my students of like, hey, I can make a mistake and it is not the end of the world. I can make a mistake and I can still learn from it. I can still go, hey, you made this mistake and adjust from it. And those are even examples of what is very inconsistent of what our students are seeing, but then also how they're perceiving those messages and using them towards their peers, but even towards others.
So having this conversation, between me and you is pretty easy, right? Because I'm not a skeptic. I'm fully on board, and I fully understand the value of this, and I've seen the value of bringing these things and the value of not just the cultural perspective, but just understanding that we are human beings we show up as human beings. But if you were to address a panel of skeptics, what is the first of these points? What's the first thing that you're going to say to try to bring them on our team?
Um, so one aspect that I've learned that I definitely didn't fully appreciate before entering into this field is the subtle but persuasive ways um, that systematic inequities manifest um, within education, but then even beyond that. We have our own implicit biases as well. And so that would be the first thing is just taking into account of, hey, this may be their perception. This may be why they believe this or how they feel about, this topic. But then it is going beyond that and saying it's not just about access to resources. So as a teacher or being in education, it's not about just access to resource though that does play a huge part. It's about those biases and and how they can be embedded, within our assessment tools that we have across all the way across the board for our students. But then also how those embedded biases affect teachers in turn, because I can't expect a student who English is their second language to be able to understand and grasp, you know, what an assessment tool may be talking about. But then even further, looking and I want to say understanding the disproportionate things that are happening within our schools. So whether are talking about identification of Black students for certain disabilities, or the cultural misunderstandings that can lead to misinterpretations of behavior, and taking that grace for others. It's easy to get very defensive because I can easily say like, yes, I love my students. Yes, I love what I do, but also being able to go, hey, tell me, why do you feel this way? Tell me why you may think that many different topics of, hey, tell me why you think that we shouldn't be talking about Black history within our textbooks. Tell me why you believe that there is not an overrepresentation of students of color. Tell me why you think that we should not be talking about diversity or we should be focused on diversity when we're hiring teachers. And so being able to grasp, hey, this is the perspective that they're coming from. Uh, I can't expect somebody who is in Texas to have the same perspective here that I have in Pennsylvania. I can't expect them to, it it looks very different, but it also is the fact of our cultural politics play a huge part of that as well. Whether we realize it or not. And so those are things that for me, in having discussions with many different people from many different backgrounds, not everybody's on the same page. And so that is something to where I just have to be honest with who I am. I don't want to change anybody's mind so that we are necessarily on the same page, because that's not always the case. But I do want to at least impart knowledge of, hey, this is what is happening in our schools. This is the reason why teaching not just Black history in our schools, but everybody's history in our schools is important. This is the reason why I also believe that when we are talking about diversity in education, this is why I believe that it is important. And so being able to give them a bit of knowledge from the perspective of this is their perception, this is their viewpoint, being able to go just provide them with those little nuggets and just leaving them there, whether you take them or whether you don't, that then is something that is beyond me. But I've done my part as just being able to just share that information and just to inform them, because that's the same thing that I do with my students, that we want for our students. We want them to receive the information, but also if we don't understand where they're coming from, then they can't, then they're not going to be receptive to receive it.
Right. And I love that response to the skeptic of, I'm not here to change your mind. I can't change your mind, but I'm here to represent me, because that's what's at the core of it, right? It's bringing yourself as a human being to the table and asking other people to do the same. So I do love that response to a skeptic. Kenyon, thank you so much for joining us. This is a really cool conversation, and I'm really excited to meet you in Baltimore. It's coming up faster than I'm ready for, to be honest with you. But I'm really excited to join you there. And anything else that you want the people to hear from you before we get to Baltimore, or what you expect your audience to engage with when they meet you there?
Honestly, the biggest thing is I'm going to show up as my authentic self, unapologetically. But I also want others to be in a space where they are willing to grow, where they are willing to have their thoughts and their perceptions um, expanded. Um, and those are things that allow us to continue to make progress within education when we're talking about these things. And so that is just the biggest thing, that not just, in Baltimore, but just in any conference, any conversation setting, I want people to be willing to come to the table with an open mindset, with the opportunity to go like, hey, I may not know a lot about this, or I may not know anything about this, and I'm okay um, hearing beyond what I believe or what I may know the definition of it being. So that's the biggest thing that I definitely just want to share.
That's awesome. And I hope that's why we're there, right? To listen with open hearts and open minds. Kenyon, thank you so much. It's going to be a real pleasure to meet you in Baltimore, and we'll see you in just a couple weeks.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right.